Peace cannot be achieved without full respect for women's rights.
Behind every number, there is a voice with an untold story.
Global stability is only possible with strong civil societies.
The words we use shape how we act.
Few are incentivized to care about impact. Many are not focused on solving the problems.
Dictators can imprison human rights fighters, but they cannot imprison the fight for human rights.
Compulsory hijab is indeed gender violence.
Online harassment is meant to push women out of public spaces.
The danger with romanticizing resilience is that it can dehumanize survivors.
LGBTQ+ is a taboo, even in human rights communities.
We should know our limits, we should define our boundaries, and learn when it is time to sit and think, and when it's time for action.
Welcome to the launch of OWRI 2021. The introduction video you just watched gave a sneak peek at what's ahead this year and featured several of the incredible activists in OWRI's network. The OWRI was founded in 2017 to bridge the gap between grassroots activists and gatekeepers to power, while ensuring members of its network have access to the resources they need to sustain their work. The idea behind the network is that uniting activists around shared core values is an effective way to safeguarding those values and also decreasing the relevancy of authoritarianism and increasing prospects for accountability. We're focused on raising awareness through narrative-driven campaigns and advocacy work that integrates the voices of the initiative's network members in key policymaking spaces. Maryum is a gender equality activist who has been working at the intersection of strategy, policy, and advocacy for over a decade. She's speaking with us today in her personal capacity. She's a leading voice in the global movement to end female genital mutilation. As a survivor of FGM, she has written extensively on the importance of creating safe spaces for trauma-informed healing. It is with great honor and pleasure that I give the mic to Maryum Saifee.
Thank you, Maryum. I want to thank you and the Oslo Women's Rights Initiative for inviting me to keynote this year's annual event. When I first met Maryum in Oslo 2 years ago, and she told me about OWRI, I was struck by the power of this diverse network with everyone united around a common vision, building a more just and equitable world. And this means not taking any shortcuts. It means digging deep into root causes of violence and conflict in some of the toughest parts of the world and in some of the toughest, on some of the toughest issues. It's a tremendous privilege for me to be with you here today virtually. We're 1 year into the pandemic. And as Maryum mentioned, I'm speaking today in my personal capacity as an advocate for gender equality. As a survivor of FGM, I'm often invited to speak on panels, and I'm often asked to limit my remarks just to my story of trauma. People will ask me to retell what happened in graphic detail. And when I first became an activist in this movement, I sort of stumbled into the movement. I would do this. I thought it was necessary in order to, raise awareness and mobilize action. And I also convinced myself I was one of the lucky ones because my parents were actually fully supportive of my advocacy work. My father was the person who encouraged me to speak out in the first place. My situation is a bit different. My aunt cut me without their consent. So my parents were as outraged as I was about what happened. But for most FGM survivors, it's much more complex. FGM is a form of intergenerational, interfamily structural violence. Often the parents are complicit in the process, and there tends to be a tremendous amount of backlash for speaking out. In the 5 or so years I've been involved in this advocacy work, I've come to realize that the act of storytelling, this reenacting of the trauma, comes with a cost. And the storyteller, usually the trauma survivor, is the one who pays the price. So what do I mean by this? When we ask a trauma survivor to reenact their story, it can be dehumanizing. There is a commodification of both the storyteller and the story. The story becomes a product, and the storyteller becomes collateral damage. This, romanticizing of resilience is actually what prompted Maryum and I to think through, how can we flip the script where we can put the storyteller first? We did this by launching the Free to Be campaign last year, which Maryum mentioned in her remarks. We invited people to talk about how we can work towards building a world we want, a more just and equitable world, rather than the world we don't want. So in my world, that meant a world where all girls are free to be whole, free to live carefree childhoods, and just free to be safe, free to be. This meant rather than fixating on the violence, in the context of FGM, for example, adjudicating what type of cut is most harmful, we stopped the debate on this entirely, which is a pretty radical act. Instead, we reframed the narrative and talked about our vision, a world where all girls are free to be whole and free from any type of violence, any type of cutting. So we flipped the script. Not only we flipped the script on the narrative, but also we put the spotlight on the humanity of survivors, and we celebrated the multiplicity of their identities. We talked about how survivors and frontline activists, many of the folks in the OWRI community and the network, are more than their stories of activism and trauma, and that they should have a meaningful seat at the table, driving policy. Their voices should be driving policy. So for me, the OWRI network represents this collective power, harnessing the lived experiences and diverse perspectives of women on the front lines, powerful women who are critical to building a more just and equitable world, a world where all of us are free to just be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maryum. It means a lot that you're spending your Saturday afternoon with us. It was such a rewarding experience for me personally to work with you, Maryum, even during the height of the pandemic. It felt like such a gift to be able to conceptualize and build with you during such an unpredictable and difficult time for everyone. And I don't think I would have been able to work with someone like you. Our collaboration, I don't think would have been possible had it not been for the pandemic. So, I guess that's the silver lining in this situation there. I wanted to talk to you more about the Free to Be campaign. It was such a special moment for me and the Oslo Women's Rights Initiative, this campaign. And you played such an integral role in it. I would love to hear more about your experiences with the campaign, and sort of, I guess we can talk about what we realized throughout the campaign. And one of the main things that sort of perpetuates gender violence is the dehumanization of victims and survivors. And so I would love to talk to you about dehumanization more, especially with focus on what you've mentioned about the romanticization of resilience and the dangers of it. And also, if we'd like to talk about the intellectualization of violence as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it was such an honor working with you on the campaign. As someone who's been in the advocacy work, I do this in my personal capacity, and it's really hard. It can be, it's stressful. It is exhausting having to continue to chip away at something that should be obvious, right? Something like FGM universally should be recognized as wrong, and we should be able to just move forward. And I realized when we were creating arguments around this particular issue, we kept talking, we were stuck in this cycle of talking about, what kind of cut is most harmful? Is it type 1 or type 2 or type 3? Rather than just saying, what are we even doing intellectualizing this, right? So I think the campaign, the Free to Be campaign, which we talked about, was really about uniting around solutions and focusing on what it is that we want. We want this, we all want, right? So it's not even about only women wanting a just and equitable world. It's everyone, whatever gender you are, however you're packaged, wherever you're from in the world. This is something, it's a common human sort of experience. So it was humanizing in the sense that we started to, it felt freeing to be part of something where it's uplifting, it's optimistic to imagine, right, this world. And before the campaign, a lot of the advocacy work had been focused on, we need to stop this thing from happening. We need to stop, this type of cutting. And then people would then say, oh, maybe this other type of cutting is okay then. If this type is really bad, it's done. And in the context of FGM, I would notice my community is originally from the subcontinent, from India. And so they would sometimes say, oh, but what we do is not as bad as what's done in Africa. Like that cut is so much worse. So they would they would racialize it, right? And further dehumanize. And instead, if we say, hey, girls, just leave them alone. They should be free to be whole, free to just exist and not be traumatized. Then it doesn't matter if it's whatever the cut. It's ridiculous to even entertain this set of arguments. That was powerful because that really closed the debate, this intellectualization of violence. And on the romanticizing of resilience, that is, I think we're in a moment of collective trauma. A year into a pandemic that's been destructive in so many of our lives. And this is, there's been a lot of trauma, a reckoning on race in the United States. And, we're coming to terms with our own history, our own traumas, and this constant, for me, it's not just the storytelling, but also the visual. It's the text and the visual of having videos and images that are, typically of people of color and, people from certain backgrounds, for example, that are, it almost desensitizes in a sense. So how do we, again, humanize the people that are courageous, that are, leading these movements, whether it's within the OWRI network or more broadly? And I think it's important, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, that the way we talk about things shapes how we act, and it gets baked into policy, and it also gets hardwired into culture.
I was muted. Yeah, I was thinking about it the other day, preparing for this event, how dehumanization theorizes the violence,
yep.
And which, it overlooks the victims and survivors of gender violence, making them more like a theory rather than, and then you kind of overlook that there's an actual human being here, yep, that's affected by it. Yeah, so you talked about, so I guess have you experienced it a lot where people romanticize your resilience?
I would say so. I think there is a sense of, it's usually well-meaning. It's usually people that they want you to, share your story in order to, really kind of get into the guts of it so that people are outraged. And it's kind of this idea. And in the beginning, when I first started doing this work, that was the norm. People would invite me onto panel discussions. And even though I have a background in policy, I have a whole life before this, nobody was interested in what I actually had to say about the topic at hand, right? Like the actual, what do I think we need to do? What are the top three things we could do to move the needle on this particular issue? They just wanted to hear this really, what felt like trauma porn, right? Like the story. And I would, almost perform it in a mechanized way, like always. I've stopped doing it. Like I've literally, somebody asked me, I rarely say yes to talking about this because I've done so much that it's out there. I've written about it. I've talked about it. I've shared my story. So it's in the public domain. If people are interested, it's there. There's no need for me to continue to keep doing this over and over because I'm now setting my own boundaries. But I do think it's salacious. It's just sort of like, oh, we need some sort of flavor to this panel. And for me, I've realized like there's no need. I mean, we wouldn't ask somebody to reenact if it's let's say the issue of, sexual assault or rape. We don't ask a rape survivor to reenact every gory detail of what happened to them. We just sort of let it be known, oh yeah, that's a bad thing. Now let's focus on how do we create a world where perpetrators are held accountable, survivors are receiving services. But in FGM, because it's typically fetishized as something happening in a faraway place, people like me tend to get romanticized as, oh wow, these kind of, almost like freak show sort of survivors. And I think that happens in a lot of issues like child marriage and any issue where it's perceived as happening somewhere over there, even though, child marriage is happening right here in the United States, or where I am, at least in the United States. And it's not seen as that. It's seen as different when it's happening to someone who maybe looks like me. And even for me, I don't look like the survivor because I don't sound like one, right? Like you're expecting someone with a particular accent or from a particular, upbringing. And so I think this romanticized, there are certain people who get romanticized more than others. And really everyone deserves to be treated with the dignity and respect of anyone. So equitable, sort of treatment and equitable value, I think, so that not one category is fetishized versus another.
And also, I guess this is a little controversial, but it feels like, even human rights organizations contribute to dehumanization.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's something that, and in many times, I don't think it's intentional. Like, I don't think that there's sort of this, let's try to dehumanize. I think it just happens because it's the cultural norm. I was just publishing a piece on human rights and how do we have a harmonized policy in the US around human rights, domestic and global. And the picture that was initially, found, it actually wasn't so bad. I mean, I've seen worse, I've seen like the images of, a henna covered hands, African sort of, presumably of African descent, we don't know, cradling a blade. And there's this is the stock Getty image, right, for FGM. And the person who was publishing said, I really struggled to find an image, because she was very much an ally in this, like not wanting to perpetuate. And so I ended up got permission from a transnational advocacy group of survivors, and included me and a few others in the photo at a retreat. And we used that photo. And of course, this editor for this publication didn't have access to the photo. And so we kind of partnered together on this to say, I want to make sure these are real people. Like, I don't want to use clip art people. I want to use like actual humans that are doing the work, elevate their work, use the image as a way to elevate their work. So even in the footnote, in the caption, the publisher actually, in small font, but hyperlink to the organization that's doing the advocacy work, that's doing the courageous work to raise awareness, both in this case in the US and in South Asia around FGM. So I think it's possible. It's harder to do. And I think that's part of what I've been shifting my focus around, is how do we, educate human rights groups more broadly that are interested in doing the right thing. How do we help them do that? And a big part of that is the narrative, how we talk about gender violence, human rights issues across the board, and also how we visually represent survivors or activists, or really anyone from any part of the world that tends to be put into a category.
Absolutely. Dehumanization is a narrative-related issue itself.
Yep.
And you once said to me in a discussion that narrative gave birth to you as an activist. And I mentioned earlier how, we always talk about, you say it all the time, how we think and talk about issues shapes how we act.
Yep.
So let's talk about narrative, the importance of it, the power of it, the influence it has had on your life.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think the way I realize too how I frame things, even when I talk about really tough issues, it can either mobilize or it can push people away. And so I think it's, the more we can use a positive language, an affirming language, a humanizing language, the better, the more inviting it is. So with the campaign, I liked the idea of the Free to Be campaign in the sense that we were really focusing on this vision. Like we can, we're in this moment of collective reflection with the pandemic. We're all kind of housebound, and what is it that we want? Why are we here? What are we trying to get out of our existence? And as activists, as humans, as people, just trying. And for me, I think the overarching narrative has been building a more just and equitable world, whether it's in the gender violence, space, trying to end gender violence for everyone, or on human rights issues or within institutions. I think that lens, the justice and equity lens, that's grounded in accountability, I think that is critical, sort of having that language towards what is it you want. And then once you can articulate, this is the vision of the world I want, then it's easier to get other people and mobilize a broader coalition around solutions. This is how we're gonna fix this. So in the context of FGM, as soon as we stopped saying, this cut, that cut, is good or bad, then people are like, oh, like, let's just get rid of all of it. Like, what are we thinking? Like, so let's create a world where we're free to be whole, free to be safe. And then that also extends beyond FGM. Like a world where everyone is free to be safe is a world where, people are respected. People are, their humanity is put, at the forefront, rather than they're just this object, as you were saying, sort of these theorized things. Like they're not really people. They're just like, they're in an anthropology textbook, or they're in, they're sort of otherized.
Exactly. And I also want to talk to you, it's still on the subject of narrative. I constantly hear we need to end GBV, gender-based violence.
Yeah.
We need to end gender-based violence. We need to end FGM, female genital mutilation. What does "end" mean? Because, like, I mean, I don't know if that's the clearest messaging.
Yeah. Well, and again, it's I think you're right. It's typically it has been, let's stop X, stop Y, end this, and yes, that's the pathway to get to the world we want. But again, if the narrative is focused on let's all imagine, a world where everyone is free to be safe, or free to be, then people feel it's a more inviting message. So in the end, a world where everyone is safe is a world where these things don't happen, right? That we've ended all these things. But in terms of mobilizing and galvanizing and getting people building this coalition beyond the converted, because I've noticed in a lot of these spaces, it's the same people, right, that show up. It's the same organizations, and it's the same half dozen or maybe dozen or two or so, depending on, as the years go by, you might add like another dozen people to your cause, but it's just a committed core. How do you go beyond the core into this broader coalition? And I think the narrative part, creating this more positive vision, is a way to invite more people into the movement. And it could be an effective, I think, and I've already seen it become a much more effective strategy. It broadens the tent.
Yeah, from my perspective, it looks like, when you talk about the world you want, it sounds realistic. Mm-hmm. When you talk about ending gender violence, it doesn't sound realistic.
Right.
Because you can't take out the hate out of people's hearts.
Right. Yeah.
But what you can do is you can minimize the space for the acceptance of gender violence.
Exactly. No, I think you're right. Because it is true, like the full eradication, for example, I say this a lot when people say, why do we need laws to ban FGM? Maybe it'll go underground or this. And I say, well, why do we need laws to ban murder or incest or anything else? They're there as a normative framework of, this is something societally, we've accepted is not the right thing. But so the idea of eradicating murder, right? It's pretty unrealistic. It's not going to, maybe it would be great if it happens. But I think to your point, it's about minimizing the space for this to happen and mobilizing people around, okay, how do we mitigate rather than completely eradicate? How do we, I would love to live in a world where not a single girl ever undergoes FGM. And I think it is actually possible. I think we can get there. But I feel like, the way we get there is by bringing people into this world where we're inviting them to imagine what it's like when everyone is not traumatized. Because if you start with the trauma and that's your entry point, it naturally, it makes you cringe. Like, I also don't even like the acronym. I don't like saying it. You know, it's just, it's sort of squeamish, right? I mean, who wants to be associated with this thing? I don't, you know, it's like, I wouldn't have, as a young girl, been like, oh, one day I want to wake up and become an activist on this issue. Like, definitely not, you know? So I think, but I, as a young girl, you know, I would want to be involved in a movement of diverse people from all over the world around justice and equity. Sign me up. Absolutely. I'm interested in that. And I think that's something universal. Most people are interested in being part of something bigger than themselves. And they're interested in forming a coalition with others to be able to get to a world where people can be free, right? People can realize their full potential, which is the point of this, right? So that everyone has this opportunity, whatever their background.
Because I feel like a problem with a lot of the organizations and companies is that are focused on social causes is that it's so go, go, go that they don't have this space to dig deep into the issues to realize solutions. So that's why, like, you know, with the work that we're doing, we do have that space to dig deep, and that's why it was so special to have you work with us, someone who's such an expert, and then, you know, you come work with us, develop, you know, the messaging, and then, you know, you sort of go back out there, and we all go back out there after we've developed this messaging together, and we spread it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the root cause analysis that you brought up is fundamental, right? I mean, you can't really solve any problem, whatever it is, without really getting a sense of like what is the core, you know, what are the drivers? So in the context of gender violence, the root cause of it is power. It's about power and it's about control. And that tends to be sort of a root cause for a lot of human rights issues more broadly. You know, this is about, you know, power and being able to hoard. Sometimes it's about hoarding power. So what the goal of a lot of the work I've been working on in the FGM space and in general is how do you decentralize, right, the power structure so that they're more equitably distributed and there's more justice, right? So there's not, and so understanding like what is the core rather than saying, okay, for example, if we go back to the example of FGM, if we just say, okay, we'll heal the wound, right? Like we'll heal the physical sort of damage, you know, you can go through a surgery, you could do this, depending on how invasive the cut is. That's nothing really in terms of the actual healing. Like healing is about understanding, you know, what are the root causes. And if it's about controlling women and girls, then in this case, that's what it is, right? It's about controlling female sexuality. Then you have to start talking to people, right, that are gatekeepers to power in the community. So, and that varies. In the context of FGM, it could be a religious leader or not. You know, in Sierra Leone, it's not about religion. It's a coming of age ceremony happening largely in rural communities. It's a way, sort of a sign of prestige, right, if you're in a certain community. So it really understanding, you know, how things manifest, why they happen. It's not necessarily universally the same everywhere. So being contextual about it so that you're saying, I'm going to look at root causes, but I'm also going to look at the context and actually talk to the people most impacted. So to get back to, you know, OWRI, you know, and the push towards having a seat at the table, making sure that people are integrated. The ones who are most impacted by issues, whatever they may be, are actually part of the process of coming up with solutions. Because if they're not at the table, then the issues it's not going to be as accurate, right, in terms of solving the problem, understanding the root cause. And I think the other piece of it is just generally activating this muscle of critical thinking so that everybody starts asking why, right? And so that everybody's, you know, involved and engaged in thinking, because the more critical thinking there is, the masses, right, are all thinking about issues in different ways and kind of digging deep, the more innovative the solutions might be, right? If lots of different people are thinking about an issue and how to come to some sort of solution, right, or some sort of you know, push towards this, again, this common vision of a more just and equitable world, the more problem solvers at the table with creative ideas, thinking deep, the better the ideas are for getting to where we want to be. So I see the root cause analysis as being almost an accelerator. It's like an incubator. It needs to happen in order for us to really harness all the talent, because we have so much. The world is a place of just so much richness and talent, of so many different ways of approaching things, and diverse minds from all over. And OWRI, I think, really represents that, given how broad-based and diverse the network is.
What are some of the barriers in the way of people who are working towards solutions to ending GBV, gender-based violence, more specifically FGM?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think, one of the barriers, resources, I think is a big one. So making sure, the grassroots groups that are really working on the ground, doing the hard work, many of them are doing it, as volunteer work, as in their side capacity. That's what I've been doing. But many of the people in my community that are advocating against FGM, they don't do this full time. This isn't something that they, have the luxury of being able to do. And so there's a lot of, need for some resources to be able to kind of connect, convene, amplify, get the messaging out. So resource distribution that's decentralized to different, these networks on the ground, more than anything, I think is critical. The second is data collection. I think it's important to understand the problem. So my community, for example, this organization I've been a part of as on their advisory board, Sahio, they've done surveys to figure out, what do people think? Is there a generational change? Are people now that there's a huge campaign in the last 5 years to raise awareness? I don't think anyone in my community doesn't know about FGM. Before, it was secretive. No one knew. My own father didn't even know what it was, until I told him, and then he was horrified that his sister did this without his consent. But it was, but a lot of men didn't know, they're sort of now, but now everyone knows. So now that everyone knows, what kind of, how are we measuring the progress of our interventions? And I think, our attitudes shifting. So that's critical to have it disaggregated by, region, gender, race, all of it, so that we know sort of, or age generationally, our younger people deciding, hey, I'm not going to do this to my kids. It's also motivating, right? When you start to see progress and that it's being measured and there's this rigor with the data collection, then you can feel kind of like, oh, cool, I'm going to keep doing this. This is working. For me, I've seen anecdotally people sharing, I have moments where I feel deflated, like, oh, like, why am I doing this? It's like a black hole. Is anything happening? And then people will message and say, because of you, I'm not going to do this to my daughter, or because of you, I'm now going to speak out, even though there's a huge cost to this, but it's worth it. It's worth it, to do this. So the data piece is important. The research is important. And I think really the third part is just narrative again. Grounding this particular issue of FGM as a human rights issue, rather than siloing it as, happening cultural practice. In some cases it was kind of characterized as an act of love, or something just sort of absurd. Like, you would never call incest an act of love. The people perpetrating might think that, but the broader society needs to use the same language to say, this is just wrong, right? This is, it's a human rights issue. It's about dignity. And so I think, it's resources, it's data, and it's language. I'd say those are the three main areas that we need to kind of work on in order to move towards, again, this solution or this vision of a just and equitable world.
Oh my God, that you just mentioned incest, and I'm like, that's so true, because if you ask the abuser or the perpetrator,
right,
they're going to say it's an act of love.
Yep.
And the same way, if you talk to perpetrators of FGM, they're going to say it's an act of love. But when it comes to FGM, we accept that narrative. We adopt
right.
that narrative because
yep.
it's culturally, because we see that issue as a culturally sensitive
exactly
issue.
And that's wow. And that's how the narrative is so powerful, because when we move it from calling it a cultural practice to a human rights issue, it flips the script entirely. It says, oh no, this is just wrong. And so the narrative has tremendous power.
Wow, incredible. Thank you so much, Maryum. Before we go, and we're going to talk more about these issues throughout the year, because there's so much more to unpack. This was literally just the start, just like a little taster of what's to come. But I would love to talk to you, first of all, about the beautiful painting behind you, and then the announcement that's related to the painting.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. So the painting behind me is of Shirley Chisholm, and she was the first Black person and first woman to be on a major presidential ticket in the United States. And so she was a very short woman who's small in stature, but huge in terms of her legacy. And she had a quote, she was often as a Black woman in the United States, which we still face today. I mean, women of color in general are facing, and in the context where I am in the US, this constantly trying to get a seat at the table. So she had a really beautiful quote that said, if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. So inspired by her, I'm in the process, kind of in the brainstorming phase of creating a podcast called Tales from the Folding Chair. And it's about highlighting these voices of people from all different backgrounds, women, men, people with disabilities, people of different religions, just different people, and what they've done to get a seat at the table and why it's mattered, and why having a more inclusive conversation, a more diverse table, proverbially table, is important for us in building this more just and equitable world.
Amazing. I'm so excited for I hope you do it. I know you're so busy. I don't know how you do everything.
It's gonna happen, inshallah. It's gonna happen. So
no, you're like this incredible. I don't want to romanticize your resilience right now.
No, but I'm so excited. And I think OWRI really represents this, the idea behind the passion behind this podcast is, OWRI, it's a powerful network of women who are often not given a seat at the table. And so, OWRI is a folding chair, this network. So I think it's important, and I'd love to, engage the network, engage others that are working in this space around inclusion, because I think inclusion isn't just a nice thing to have, it's just essential, and it makes everything better. It's not a zero-sum game, right? When it comes to power, it's about the more diverse, a friend uses this analogy, when you're baking it, like you can bake a bigger cake if you have more cooks. So this is about everyone kind of benefiting. And so that's the idea and the drive behind it.
Oh, well, I'm so excited for it. Keep us updated. And thank you so much again for joining today and speaking. Yeah, we'll relaunch, sorry, what's the word? We'll re-release this video and put it on YouTube later. So
thank you. Well, I'm so excited, and it's been such an honor. And this is a beautiful network, and I'm so excited for the conversations that will be coming throughout the year. I love that this is and not just one event, but it's throughout the year. And I think it's so important to keep the momentum going around this. It's so critical.
Yeah, absolutely, Maryum. I completely agree. That's why I'm so excited that we're taking the OWRI from an annual event and trying to turn it into this decentralized year-round operation. And I'm so excited about, we have a podcast coming up. We already released the first episode.
Yes, I saw. It was amazing. I love it. A seat at the table. I love it. It was beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all your help with it as well. And next episode's coming, the second episode's coming out next week. And we have a video discussion series that we're currently developing on online harassment, which is huge.
So critical. So important.
Critical. We need to talk about it. I'm hoping the video discussion series on online harassment will help shape policy, because that's ultimately why we're doing everything that we're doing here. So thank you so much, Maryum, and I wish you a beautiful weekend.
Thank you. Thank you. It's sunny finally today, so I hope others can, if there's sun in their lives, will go out and leave the virtual behind for a little bit as well.
I'm going for a walk just now.
Okay, perfect. Excellent.
I'll talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye. Take care.
You.
Thank you so much.